You're not a husband anymore, Richard. You're a maintenance contract I renewed by mistake. Nobody moved. Somewhere behind me, the dishwasher kept running its rinse cycle, a low mechanical hum that suddenly sounded enormous in that silence. Nobody coughed. Nobody reached for a glass. My daughter's fork stopped halfway to her mouth and just stayed there, suspended, like she'd forgotten what forks were for. And I sat there at the head of my own dinner table, feeling exactly like an old coat nobody bothers taking out of the closet anymore, not because it's ruined, just because the seasons changed, and someone decided it didn't fit the new decor. My name is Richard Colby. I'm 63 years old, and until 18 months ago, I thought I understood exactly what a good marriage was supposed to feel like. I should back up. I've spent 41 years repairing watches. Not big watches. Not the kind you see in magazine ads with actors leaning against yachts. Small ones. Old ones. The kind people bring in wrapped in a grandfather's handkerchief, apologizing for how badly they've let it run down, like the watch itself has feelings about being neglected. I started with one bench in the back of a hardware store in Rockport, Maine in 1985. By the time I sold the last of my 7 repair shops 11 years ago, I'd worked 71-hour weeks for the better part of a decade just to keep the doors open, and I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it matters later. A man who spends 4 decades learning to notice the difference between a watch that's slightly wrong and a watch that's exactly right develops a particular kind of eye. It doesn't turn off just because he retires. I paid for my daughter Claire's nursing degree in full, $86,400 over 4 years, because her mother and I agreed early on that debt shouldn't be the price of a good life. I quietly funded a scholarship at the trade school, 2 towns over for going on 15 years now. 12 young watchmakers who never knew my name was attached to it because I didn't want thanks. I wanted the craft to survive me. Those are just numbers. I mention them only because for most of my life, giving quietly was the only kind of strength I understood. My first wife, Margaret, died of ovarian cancer 7 years ago. 29 years of marriage, and then 11 months of watching her get smaller in a hospital bed, and then nothing. I don't talk about the specifics much. What I will say is this: even now, 7 years later, I have not once set foot in the east wing of Rockport Memorial, the wing with the oncology ward, not even to visit an old friend recovering from a hip surgery 2 floors up. I told my daughter I'd catch him another time. I have missed 3 of my own cardiology follow-ups this past year alone, always with a reasonable excuse ready before the receptionist even finishes asking. A man can face down an angry, drunk son-in-law twice his size, or so I'm told other men have done, and still flinch like a schoolboy at the sound of a hospital's automatic doors. I'm not proud of that. I'm only telling you because it's true, and because everything that happened later would have gone differently if I'd been a little braver about doctors a little sooner. I met Vanessa Reyes at a charity auction for the Maritime Museum 3.5 years ago. She was 32 then, sharp, funny, in a way that caught you off guard, the kind of woman who could make a room of stiff donors laugh without anyone quite noticing she'd done it. She told me she found old things beautiful. She held up a chipped porcelain teapot at that auction and said something like, "Everyone else in this room sees a flaw. I see 150 years that decided to keep going anyway." I married her 14 months later. My daughter didn't come to the wedding. She came to the reception, stayed 40 minutes, and left before the cake was cut. I told myself that was grief talking, not judgment. Grief has a long memory, and Claire had buried her mother only 4 years before I remarried. I understood. Or, I told myself I did. The comment about the maintenance contract, the one I opened with, happened on a Tuesday evening about 6 weeks before everything else in this story. We'd had a small disagreement over dinner, nothing dramatic. Just me gently pushing back on the idea of trading in my 2011 truck for something newer. Vanessa didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. That was, I think now, one of the more dangerous things about her. She simply set down her wine glass, looked at me the way you'd look at an appliance that had stopped being worth the repair bill, and said what she said. Claire was there. My son-in-law Tom was there. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. And then Vanessa smiled, apologized for being dramatic, and asked if anyone wanted more of the risotto, as if she'd made an off-color joke about traffic. I want to be honest about something. I didn't leave that dinner angry. I left it quiet in a way that worried me more than anger would have. Because a man who spent his whole life examining tiny mechanisms for the one gear that's fractionally out of alignment doesn't stop noticing things just because the mechanism in question is his own marriage. There'd been small things before that dinner. If I'm honest with myself now, things I'd let pass because I didn't want to be the suspicious old husband, the cautionary tale, the man who married too fast and then couldn't trust his own good fortune. Vanessa had started angling her phone away from me on the kitchen counter. A small motion, barely anything, the screen going dark half a second before I glanced over. She'd taken up early morning reformer Pilates at a studio 40 minutes away, 4 mornings a week, when the studio 2 miles from our house offered the exact same classes. And there was the pocket watch, Margaret's father's pocket watch, an 1897 Elgin, 16 size, hunter case, the one thing of Margaret's. I'd kept on my nightstand every night for 7 years, the one I always said I'd give to Claire's boy Sam someday, when he was old enough to wind it properly. 3 months before that dinner, Vanessa had picked it up while dusting, turned it over in her hands and asked, almost idly, what something like that would fetch at auction these days. I told her it wasn't for sale, not now, not ever. She laughed and said she was just curious. Sentimental value was so hard to put a number on, wasn't it? I let it go. I let almost everything go that year. I think some part of me had decided that noticing too closely was its own kind of betrayal, and I'd rather be a fool than a man who couldn't trust his own wife. That changed on the night of our anniversary gala. I should explain what that was. Every October, the Watchmakers Guild I helped found decades ago holds a dinner to mark the anniversary of the first shop's opening, back in 1985. It's a small thing by most standards. Maybe 120 people, old customers, retired craftsmen, a few reporters from the trade papers who still remember when Rockport Repair was 7 storefronts instead of a name on a sold sign. This past October marked the 40th year since I first hung that sign. Claire helped me plan it. Vanessa insisted on handling the seating chart and the toast list herself, which should have told me something. Though at the time I only thought she was being generous. 61 people had already found their seats when Vanessa stood, tapped her champagne glass with a spoon, and asked for everyone's attention. I wasn't going to say anything tonight, she began, her voice doing that lovely practiced wobble I'd once found so charming, because this is Richard's night. But I can't sit here another minute without telling all of you what he doesn't know yet either. I remember my stomach dropping before she even finished the sentence. The way you feel a watch's mainspring give a fraction of a second before you hear it snap. We're having a baby. The room did exactly what rooms are trained to do at moments like that. It erupted. Glasses lifted. Someone at the back table let out a whoop that startled the caterer into dropping a tray of empty flutes, and the crash of glass against the ballroom's hardwood floor rang out under all that applause like a small, private alarm only I seemed to hear. Claire, 3 tables away, went very still, the same way she had at that dinner 6 weeks earlier, fork suspended, face unreadable. Tom put his hand on her shoulder. I sat there with 61 pairs of eyes swinging toward me, waiting for my face to do the thing everyone expected it to do. Joy, shock, tears, the whole grateful old man routine, and for one terrible, honest second, I felt none of those things. I felt the exact cold stillness I imagine a man feels when he opens a case back expecting to find a jewel movement and instead finds an empty space where the jewel should be. I have a vasectomy. I had it done 19 years ago, 4 months after Claire turned 15, at Margaret's insistence and my own full agreement, because we'd both decided one daughter was the family we wanted, and we'd never once regretted it. I sat in that ballroom doing arithmetic I had no business doing in public, feeling my own heartbeat in my ears louder than the applause, and across the room, 3 tables back, near the exit doors, I caught the eye of Dr. Elena Ruiz. Elena had been Margaret's OB-GYN for the last 6 years of Margaret's life, and had stayed, somehow, one of the 2 or 3 people I still call when something in my chest feels like it's cracking. She wasn't clapping. She was watching me, her champagne untouched on the table in front of her, and something in her expression, careful, unreadable, professionally composed, in a way I recognized from all those years, watching doctors deliver bad news to Margaret, made the hair on my arms stand up before a single word had passed between us. Vanessa sat back down beside me, radiant, glowing in the particular way expectant mothers are supposed to glow, and slid her hand into mine under the table. "Say something," she whispered, smiling for the room. "Everyone's watching." I looked at my wife. I looked at the ring on her finger, the one I'd chosen because she said she liked things that had survived something. And for the first time in 3.5 years of marriage, I understood that I did not, in fact, know this woman at all. I smiled for the room. I said something about being the luckiest man in the ballroom. I have spent 41 years learning to keep my hands perfectly steady while working on mechanisms worth more than most people's cars. And that training held right up until the toasts ended and the band started and Vanessa excused herself to freshen up, and Elena Ruiz crossed the room, sat down in the empty chair beside me, and said 4 words I have not been able to stop hearing since. "Richard, we need to talk." We stepped out onto the terrace behind the ballroom, away from the band and the clinking glasses, into air that smelled like October in the harbor a half-mile off. Elena didn't waste time on pleasantries. She'd delivered too much bad news over too many years to dress it up. "I saw Vanessa 3 weeks ago," she said. "For what she told your front desk was a 12-week prenatal visit." "Okay," I said, because I didn't yet understand why that sentence was being delivered like a diagnosis. "Richard, I didn't examine her. She never made it past the waiting room. She canceled twice more after that, both times within an hour of the appointment. And this afternoon, before the gala, I got a call from my nurse, Priya, who mentioned in passing that a patient named Vanessa Colby had come by the office to pick up a printed ultrasound image from 3 weeks ago, one that was never actually taken in our office because there was no visit." Elena paused, watching my face carefully, the way she used to watch Margaret's face when she was about to say something that would change the shape of a day. "I checked our system twice before I came tonight because I wanted to be wrong. There is no ultrasound. There is no 12-week visit. There is no chart entry with your wife's name on it past the initial consultation 8 months ago, where, for what it's worth, her intake paperwork listed a tubal ligation performed 6 years prior in Phoenix." I stood very still. Behind us, through the terrace doors, I could hear the band starting a slow number, could hear my own name being said fondly by someone toasting my 40 years in the trade, could hear underneath all of it the sound of a mechanism I thought I understood turning out to have gears I'd never once been shown. "She's not pregnant," I said. Not a question. I needed to hear it out loud in my own voice before I could believe it belonged to my own life. "I can't confirm anything definitively without her medical records, which I have no legal right to pull without her consent," Elena said carefully, always the professional even now. "But Richard, I've delivered 1,100 babies in 30 years of practice. I know what a genuine 12-week prenatal visit looks like on paper, and what she has doesn't look like that. It looks like someone building a folder." I want to tell you I felt rage in that moment. That would make for a better story. I think the wronged husband, righteous and burning. What I actually felt was smaller and colder than that. Something closer to what I feel in the shop when I open a case back on a watch I was told was a genuine 1960s piece, and find modern machine tooling where hand finishing should be, not fury, recognition, the particular sinking recognition of a forgery you should have caught sooner. "Don't say anything to her tonight," Elena said, reading my face. "Please, whatever this is, you deserve to understand it before you react to it." I nodded, and I went back inside, and I danced one slow wooden dance with my wife while 61 people who loved me watched us sway under string lights, and I smiled the whole time, because 41 years at a workbench teaches you that the worst thing you can do when you found a flaw is let your hands shake before you finish the examination. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Vanessa in the dark, listening to her breathing settle into the slow rhythm of real sleep, and I thought about the pocket watch question from 3 months earlier, and the phone angled away on the counter, and the Pilates studio 40 minutes from a house with one 2 miles closer, and I understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives at 3 in the morning, that I had spent a year and a half deliberately not looking at something my own eyes had already flagged a dozen times over. Claire called me at 7 the next morning. She never calls before 9, not since she started working nights and sleeping through most mornings when she can get them, Dad. Her voice had that flat, controlled quality I recognized from years of watching her deliver hard news to patients' families over the phone in the next room. I need to ask you something, and I need you to not get defensive. Go ahead. When Vanessa announced last night, did that surprise you? I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where 6 weeks earlier my wife had compared me to an expired maintenance contract, and I told my daughter the truth, all of it. The vasectomy, Elena's face across the ballroom, the terrace conversation. Claire was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. I've been trying to tell myself I was being paranoid, she finally said, for months. I didn't want to be the daughter who couldn't accept her father's new wife, Dad. I know how that story sounds. I know how it looks when the grown daughter can't stand her father's second marriage. So I kept my mouth shut every single time something felt wrong because I was so afraid of being that person. What kind of things? I asked. Prenatal vitamins, Claire said. I noticed the bottle in your bathroom cabinet 3 weeks ago when I stopped by to drop off Sam's old crib for storage. Full bottle, unopened seal, Dad. A woman who's actually taking prenatal vitamins doesn't have a full sealed bottle 3 weeks after telling her doctor's office she's 12 weeks along. And 2 nights ago, at your place, when you went to get more ice, I watched her finish half a glass of wine in under a minute. Pregnant women who are being careful don't do that. Pregnant women who aren't pregnant do that. I sat there with the phone against my ear, feeling something in my chest that was equal parts vindication and grief, because being right about this was so much worse than being wrong would have been. There's something else, Claire said, and I heard her take a breath the way she does before delivering the hardest part of any conversation. Tom saw her 3 Saturdays ago. Not at Pilates, at the gym on Route 1, the one with the smoothie bar. He was there for his own session, and he saw her in the parking lot with a guy, tall, maybe late 30s, gym clothes, the kind of trainer-looking guy who has his own logo on his water bottle. They weren't doing anything obviously wrong, Dad. She got in his car. They sat there for almost 20 minutes before she got out and drove off in her own car. Tom didn't think much of it at the time. He mentioned it to me almost as an aside. I didn't put it together with anything until last night. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside my kitchen window, a gull was working over something in the driveway with the patient, methodical persistence gulls always have, and I found myself watching it instead of thinking, because thinking had become, for the moment, unbearable. I don't want to blow up my own marriage over a hunch and half a glass of wine, I finally said. I know, Claire said. That's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to actually look, Dad, the way you look at everything else. You've never once in your life let a flaw pass just because looking closer was inconvenient. Don't start now. That week I did something I am not proud of and would not recommend, though I understood, watching myself do it, that I was only extending a skill I'd spent 41 years perfecting into a room of my own house I'd never thought to examine. I am not a hacker. I don't own any surveillance software, and I want to be clear that nothing I'm about to describe involved anything illegal or anything I'd advise another man to do lightly. What I did was simpler and, in its own way, sadder. I paid closer attention. I noticed which drawer in her office desk she never left unlocked. The one small brass-hinged wooden box, the kind you'd buy at a stationery shop for holding letters, tucked under a stack of yoga magazines. I noticed that the printed ultrasound image sitting in a frame on our bedroom dresser, the one she'd shown me tearfully the morning after the gala, had a timestamp printed along the bottom edge in a font that didn't match any of the 3 imaging formats Rockport Memorial's radiology department actually uses, a detail I only caught because I'd spent 4 decades training my eyes to notice when 2 pieces of the same supposed original don't quite belong to each other. A watch dial engraved by 2 different hands in 2 different decades always has a seam if you know where to look. This had one. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I called Howard Pruitt instead, my attorney of 22 years, and asked him, carefully, hypothetically, what would happen to my estate plan if I had a child at 63. Howard, who has known me long enough to hear what I'm not saying as clearly as what I am, was quiet for a moment before he answered. Your current trust splits everything between Claire and any future biological or legally adopted children, Richard, with Claire's share protected at a minimum of 40%, regardless of family additions. But 6 weeks ago, Vanessa's attorney sent my office a proposed amendment. It would restructure the trust so that a child born during your current marriage receives 60% outright at birth, held in guardianship naturally, until the child comes of age. Guardianship of a minor beneficiary's trust share typically defaults to the custodial parent. He let that sit. You didn't sign it. I flagged some language I didn't love and sent it back for revision 3 weeks ago. I haven't heard anything since. 3 weeks ago, the same week the ultrasound with the wrong timestamp appeared on our dresser. The same week the sealed bottle of prenatal vitamins sat untouched in the bathroom cabinet. I want to pause here and say something plainly because I think it matters more than any of the mechanics of what came next. I had genuinely, foolishly, completely believed that a woman 31 years younger than me had fallen in love with an aging watchmaker who talked too much about gear trains and not enough about anything interesting. I had believed that because believing the alternative meant admitting that the last 3.5 years of my life, the years I'd told myself were proof I could still be happy after Margaret, had been something closer to a very patient, very well-run repair job on an old, trusting machine. The financial piece of it, once Howard walked me through it fully, wasn't complicated, and I won't spend long on it because the numbers were never really the point. 60% of a trust built from 41 years of 71-hour weeks, held in guardianship by a woman who, according to Howard's investigator, had opened a joint LLC bank account 11 weeks earlier, one I'd never been asked to co-sign, with a man named Marcus Vance listed as co-signatory under the title Wellness Consultant. Marcus Vance, it turned out, was the tall man from the gym parking lot. Marcus Vance, it turned out, had 2 prior civil judgments against him in Arizona for what the court documents dryly called breach of fiduciary duty in the management of an elderly client's retirement account, a case that had been quietly settled out of court 4 years before he ever set foot in Maine. I sat in Howard's office with that folder open in front of me and felt, for the first time since the gala, something that wasn't cold recognition. It was grief, plain and simple, the specific grief of understanding that the second chance you'd allowed yourself, cautiously, gratefully, after burying the first great love of your life, had never been a chance at all. It had been a job someone else had been running the entire time. "What do you want to do?" Howard asked, closing the folder. I thought about Margaret, who used to say that the only thing worse than a liar was letting a liar think they'd won before you'd finished the job. I thought about the pocket watch on my nightstand, the one Vanessa had once idly priced for auction. I thought about Claire's voice on the phone, careful and brave, telling me the truth she'd swallowed for months because she loved me too much to risk sounding jealous. "I want to know everything," I said. "All of it. Before I say a single word to her." That was 4 weeks ago. What I found in those 4 weeks, working quietly with Howard's investigator and, eventually, with Elena Ruiz's careful, professional cooperation once she understood the full shape of what her medical records had actually caught, is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Because the thing I discovered wasn't simply that my wife had faked a pregnancy to move 60% of my life's work into a joint account with a man named Marcus Vance. It was that Vanessa wasn't entirely the architect of what happened to me. She was, in a way I didn't expect, and still find myself struggling to feel simple anger about, being run by someone else the entire time. Someone who had done this before, to another aging man, in another state, and walked away clean while that man's family picked up the pieces. I didn't know that yet, not on the night of the gala, not even in Howard's office, with the folder open in front of me. I knew only that the woman sleeping beside me every night believed, as far as I could tell, that she was 3 weeks from a follow-up ultrasound for a baby that had never existed, and that somewhere on Route 1, a man with a logo on his water bottle was waiting to find out exactly how much of my 41 years he was about to walk away with. Point 1, architected narrative layers, weaving evidence, character motivations, climactic confrontation, architected narrative layers, weaving evidence, character motivations, climactic confrontation. Howard's investigator, a quiet, unhurried woman named Raina Ostrander, who'd spent 18 years doing forensic accounting before going private, called me on a Thursday morning with a voice that told me before her words did that whatever she'd found wasn't going to make anything easier. "I found the Arizona family," she said. "The one from Marcus Vance's civil judgment. A widower named Harold Feinberg, 81, in Scottsdale. His son agreed to talk to me on the record. I didn't know it yet, but the story Raina was about to tell me was going to be, almost beat for beat, the story I was living. Harold Feinberg had remarried at 76, 4 years after losing his wife of 48 years. His new wife, 26 years younger, had announced a pregnancy 9 months into the marriage. There had been a joint account. There had been a wellness consultant named Marcus Vance, who back then went by his middle name, Marcus Daniel, listed on the paperwork as a fitness and lifestyle coach for the young wife. There had been a trust amendment drafted and nearly signed. What there had never been, in the end, was a baby or a wife who stuck around once the money moved, or a Marcus who answered his phone once the civil suit was filed. Harold's son had gotten the account frozen 4 days before the transfer cleared. 4 days. His father had been luckier than he knew, and it had cost the family $210,000 in legal fees to prove what everyone in the family had already understood in their gut a full year earlier. "He's done this before," Raina said. "At least once. Probably more than once, if I had to guess, given how clean the pattern is. He finds men your age who remarried after losing a spouse. He finds women in their 30s who are, and I want to be careful how I say this, Richard, financially precarious enough to be persuadable, and lonely enough in the marriage to be reachable. He doesn't marry them himself. He never puts his own name on anything that matters. He just waits at the edges until the money moves, and then he's gone before anyone thinks to look at him twice." I sat with that for a long moment in my workshop, at the same bench where I'd spent 4 decades learning to trust nothing until I'd examined it under magnification twice. Outside, October had gone fully gray, the harbor the color of an old caseback that needed polishing. I thought about Vanessa at that Maritime Museum auction 3.5 years ago, holding up a chipped teapot, telling me she saw 150 years that decided to keep going anyway. I wondered for the first time whether that woman had ever existed at all, or whether I'd been shown exactly what I was primed to fall for, the same way Harold Feinberg had been shown exactly what he needed to see. "There's one more thing," Raina said. "It's not proof of anything criminal on its own, but I think you should know it before you decide what to do next. Go ahead. Vanessa's mother is in a memory care facility outside Providence, has been for 2 years. It's a good facility. It's also $14,000 a month, and Vanessa's been covering the difference her insurance doesn't, after her father's pension ran dry 18 months ago. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for her, Richard. I'm telling you because I think it matters for understanding how someone like Marcus finds someone like her. He doesn't find greedy women. From what I can tell, he finds frightened ones, and then he gives them a story where they get to stop being frightened." I hung up the phone and sat in my workshop for a long time without touching a single tool, which is not something I do. My hands, which have stayed steady through 41 years of gem setting and hairspring repair, were not steady that afternoon. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, a thin, unwelcome thread of pity running underneath everything else, the anger, the humiliation, the grief for a marriage I now understood had never really existed. It didn't make what Vanessa had done to me acceptable. It didn't make the 60% of my life's work she'd tried to move into a stranger's account any less real. But it made the shape of the whole thing sadder than I'd let myself imagine. And sadder, I've found, is somehow harder to carry than simple fury would have been. That night I told Claire everything Raina had found. We sat on my back porch, the same porch where Margaret and I used to watch the harbor go dark in October, and my daughter, who had spent the last 4 weeks being braver and steadier than I had any right to expect from a woman half my age, finally cracked. Not from anger. From relief, I think. The particular relief of finally being allowed to feel something she'd been holding in check since the day of that dinner with the maintenance contract comment. I kept a list, she admitted, wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand, embarrassed by her own tears in a way that reminded me painfully of her mother. In my phone, every little thing that felt wrong. I called it notes for work so Tom wouldn't ask. I've had it for 8 months, Dad. 8 months of writing down things I was too scared to say out loud because I didn't want to be the jealous daughter who couldn't share her father. You were never that, I said. I know that now. She laughed, a short, wet sound. I think some part of me needed you to say it before I could believe it. I put my arm around her, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and I realized it was the first time in longer than I wanted to admit that I'd let my daughter see me be something other than steady. Margaret used to be the one who cried easily in our house, the one who hugged first, and asked questions later, and somewhere in the 7 years since I'd lost her, I'd let myself become the kind of father who thought strength meant never needing to be held. Claire held on a while longer than either of us expected, and I let her, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight since the terrace at the gala finally, briefly let go. The wooden box came into it 3 days later, and I want to be honest about how, because I don't want to pretend to a cleverness I don't deserve credit for. I wasn't hunting for it. Vanessa had left for what she still called her OB follow-up, an appointment that, per Elena, did not and would never exist, and in her hurry she'd left the small brass-hinged box, unlocked on her desk for the first time in 3.5 years of marriage. I stood in the doorway of her office for a long moment before I crossed the room, because some part of me, even then, still wanted to be wrong. Inside, under a folder of printed vitamin coupons meant, I understood now purely for show, was a single handwritten letter, 3 pages, in a looping hand I didn't recognize. It was signed Marcus. I won't reproduce all of it. Some of it I've never told even Claire in full, and some of it, frankly, isn't mine to share, not because it would embarrass me, but because a man's cruelty toward a frightened woman deserves less audience than her own account of it someday might. But there was a paragraph near the bottom I have not been able to stop hearing since I read it, and I think you should hear it, because it's the reason everything that came after happened exactly the way it did. Marcus had written that once the trust amendment cleared, Vanessa's involvement would be concluded. His word, concluded, the way you'd conclude a business quarter. He'd written that he'd already begun transitioning the joint LLC account to a structure she wouldn't have signing authority over. He'd written, and this is the sentence I read 4 times before I could make myself believe a stranger had written it about my wife. You were always the piece of this that was easiest to replace, V. Don't make this harder than it has to be when the time comes. I sat down on the edge of Vanessa's desk chair and read that sentence a 5th time, and something in me that had been braced for a fight against a woman who'd wronged me quietly rearranged itself into something closer to a fight against a man who was about to wrong 2 people at once. And only one of us knew it yet. I put the letter back exactly where I'd found it, box unlocked, folder replaced, nothing disturbed, because Howard had been clear about the value of letting the other side believe they were still winning right up until the moment they weren't. Then I called Elena Ruiz, and I called Reina Ostrander, and I called my old friend Sal Marchetti, who'd sat next to me at every Thursday morning Gear Club meeting for the last 19 years, and who happened, conveniently, to also be a retired district court clerk who understood exactly how to make sure evidence like a handwritten letter and a fabricated ultrasound stood up when it mattered. And then, 3 days after that, Vanessa came to me glowing in that same practiced, radiant way she'd glowed at the gala, and told me she wanted to throw a baby shower. A real one, she said. Family, old friends from the guild, a proper celebration, because she was finally starting to feel like this was real. I didn't know it yet, but that request was the single luckiest thing that happened in this entire story, because it handed me, without her understanding what she was doing, exactly the room full of witnesses I needed. Of course, I told her, and I meant it to sound like the words of a grateful, aging husband, and something in how easily they came out of me frightened me a little, because I understood in that moment exactly how good a liar I'd become in 4 short weeks. Learning, I suppose, from the best teacher I'd ever had, we set the date for 3 weeks out. Vanessa wanted it at the Guildhall, the same venue as the anniversary gala, for symmetry, she said. And I agreed to that too, because symmetry, it turned out, was going to matter to me for reasons she couldn't yet imagine. In those 3 weeks, I did 3 things. I asked Howard to quietly finalize, with my full and documented consent this time, a revised trust that protected Claire's inheritance at 70% regardless of any future marital changes. Closing the exact door Marcus Vance had spent 8 months trying to walk Vanessa through. I asked Elena to compile, carefully and within the bounds of what the law allowed her to disclose given the fraud involved, a formal record of the missing prenatal visits and the fabricated ultrasound, prepared to be handed directly to the county prosecutor's office the moment I gave the word, and I took the Elgin pocket watch, Margaret's father's watch, the one Vanessa had once idly priced for auction, into my own workshop for the first time in 7 years, meaning only to have the crystal replaced before I finally gave it, as I'd always promised myself I would, to my grandson Sam for his 9th birthday that December. What I found inside the caseback, tucked behind the movement in a space I'd checked 100 times over the years, and somehow, impossibly, never noticed held anything at all, was a folded square of paper in Margaret's handwriting, brittle at the creases, dated 11 months before she died. I didn't know it yet, sitting alone at my bench with that letter unopened in my hand. But reading it 3 weeks later, out loud, in a room full of people who loved me, was going to be the moment that finally let me stop being afraid of every hospital corridor and every quiet Tuesday and every version of loss I'd spent 7 years trying to outrun. I set it aside, unread, on the shelf above my bench, because some part of me understood, without being able to explain why, that I wasn't ready for it yet, and that I would know exactly when I was. I had 3 weeks to plan a confrontation I'd never trained for in 41 years of gear trains and hairsprings. 3 weeks to figure out how a quiet man who'd spent his whole life avoiding scenes was going to stand in front of a room full of guests and let the truth do what it needed to do. And 3 weeks to decide whether I was capable of watching my wife's face when she finally understood that the man across from her had already read the letter that ended her. The 3 weeks before the shower moved strangely, the way time does when you're waiting for something you've already decided is inevitable. I went to work every morning, restrung a customer's grandfather clock, replaced a mainspring on a 1952 Omega that had sat in someone's drawer for 30 years, did all the ordinary things a watchmaker does, and underneath every ordinary motion of my hands ran a second, quieter set of calculations I'd never had to make before in my life. Vanessa, for her part, seemed happier than she'd been in months. I understand now why. Marcus's letter had told her the trust amendment was close, that the time was coming, and I think some frightened, cornered part of her had convinced herself that once the money moved, once her mother's facility was paid through in full, and Marcus had concluded whatever he'd promised to conclude, some version of relief was waiting on the other side. I watched her plan a party for a baby that had never existed, choosing linens, arguing cheerfully with the caterer about whether the cake should say, "welcome" or "blessed." And I found that my anger toward her kept softening at the edges into something more complicated, even as my resolve about Marcus Vance hardened into something I didn't fully recognize in myself. I saw him once during those 3 weeks, from a distance, in the parking lot of the gym on Route 1. Raina had shown me a photograph beforehand, so I'd know his face, tall, tan, in a way that doesn't happen naturally in Maine in October, the kind of practiced, forgettable handsomeness men like that seem to cultivate on purpose. I sat in my truck across the lot for 11 minutes, watching him load gym bags into a leased BMW with Arizona plates that hadn't been re-registered. And I thought about Harold Feinberg in Scottsdale, And I thought about a sentence in a letter that called my wife the easiest piece to replace. And I understood, with a clarity that frightened me a little, that whatever I did in that guild hall in 3 weeks' time wasn't only going to be for me. Claire wanted to be there the day of the shower, obviously, and Tom and my grandson Sam, who was 9 now, and had no idea what any of the adults around him were quietly preparing for. Elena agreed to come as a guest, the way she always did to guild events, carrying in her handbag a sealed folder she'd prepared with Howard's guidance, one that would only ever need to come out if I gave a specific signal, a hand on the back of my own chair, something small enough that Vanessa would never notice it coming. Sal Marchetti, retired clerk, 19 years my Thursday morning friend, agreed to sit near the door with a manila envelope of his own, notarized copies of the Trust Amendment history, in case anyone in the room needed the paper trail spoken into plain language a jury or a reporter could understand later. Howard couldn't attend himself but stayed reachable by phone the entire afternoon, a fact that gave me more comfort than I expected. I didn't know, walking into the guild hall that Saturday afternoon in late November, whether I was doing the right thing. I still don't know, some nights, whether there was a gentler way to have done it. What I knew, standing in the doorway watching pastel balloons sway gently near the same stage where 61 people had cheered 8 weeks earlier, was that I could not spend one more day being a man who let the people who loved him keep swallowing the truth to protect him from having to face it. The hall filled slowly, the way these things do. 40, then 60, then close to 80 guests, old customers, guild members, 2 of Vanessa's co-workers from the design firm where she used to work before we married, her cousin down from Bangor. Marcus Vance was not on the guest list, obviously, and had no reason to be there, and that had worried me more than almost anything else in the planning. But Raina had confirmed, through channels I still don't fully understand and didn't ask too many questions about, that Marcus had a habit, going back to the Feinberg case, of positioning himself nearby during what he called closing weeks, close enough to monitor, never close enough to be named. She was right. He came in 11 minutes after the gifts had started piling up on the table near the stage, dressed like a distant cousin, nodding politely to people he'd clearly researched enough to greet by name, and took a seat near the back, close to the exit, exactly the kind of seat a man chooses when part of him is already planning to leave before anyone asks who he is. Vanessa saw him. I watched her see him, watched the smallest flicker cross her face. Relief and fear knotted together in a way that told me, more clearly than anything Raina had found, that some part of my wife had understood for a while now that this arrangement was never going to end well for her either. I let the gifts happen. I let the small talk happen. The toasts, a guild member's wife, reading a poem about new beginnings that I'm sure was lovely and that I did not hear a single word of, because my whole attention had narrowed the way it does at the bench when you're seconds from either fixing something or breaking it forever. Claire sat 2 seats down from me, Sam on her lap, and every few minutes her eyes would find mine, checking the way she used to check when she was small and about to jump off the high dock at the lake house, and needed to know I was still watching. Elena stood when the cake was wheeled out, on cue, the folder already resting on her lap, and asked, in the easy professional voice she'd used to deliver 1,000 pieces of medical news over 30 years, whether she could say a few words as Vanessa's doctor and an old family friend. The room quieted. Vanessa's smile stayed fixed in place a half-second too long. "I want to start," Elena said, "by saying how much I love this family and how hard this is for me to do. But I took an oath a long time ago that matters more to me than my own comfort, and part of that oath is telling the truth when a patient's safety, or a family's, is on the line." She opened the folder. "Vanessa, there is no record in my office of a 12-week ultrasound. There is no record of any prenatal visit past our initial consultation 8 months ago. The image on Richard's dresser did not come from our imaging department. I've spent 3 weeks hoping I was somehow wrong about all of this. I'm not." The silence that followed was not the polite breath-held silence of the gala. It had teeth in it. Somewhere near the drink table, A spoon clinked once against a glass and then went still, the sound hanging there, absurdly loud, the way small sounds do when 80 people have simultaneously stopped breathing. That's insane, Vanessa said, too fast, her voice climbing half an octave. Alina, I don't know what you think you're, Richard? She turned to me, and I watched her searching my face for the man who danced with her under string lights 8 weeks earlier, smiling for a room, keeping his hand steady. She didn't find him. I know, I said quietly. I've known for 3 weeks. Somewhere near the back of the room, Marcus Vance stood up. I don't think he meant to. I think it was pure reflex. The animal instinct of a man realizing the exit he'd chosen for its convenience was about to become a great deal less convenient. But standing was the wrong move in a room of 80 people, already straining to understand what was happening, because it drew every eye in the hall directly to him, a stranger nobody could quite place, moving toward the door a beat too fast. Sir, Sal Marchetti said, rising from his seat near the exit with the unhurried authority of a man who spent 19 years telling far more dangerous people than a fitness consultant that court was not yet adjourned. I'd ask you to sit back down for just a few more minutes. I don't know what this is, Marcus said, already reaching for his jacket. I think I'm at the wrong event. You're at exactly the right event, Mr. Vance, I said, and I felt my own voice come out steadier than I had any right to expect. Or should I call you Mr. Daniel? Harold Feinberg's family might know you better by that name. I have relived that sentence more times than I can count in the weeks since. I've wondered whether I said it out of strategy or out of something closer to fury. I hadn't let myself feel until that exact moment. Watching a man who'd called my wife the easiest piece to replace try to slip out a side door while she sat frozen at the center of a room full of people who'd come to celebrate a lie he'd built for her, Marcus went very still. It's a specific kind of stillness, I've come to understand, the stillness of a man doing arithmetic on how much is actually known versus how much can still be talked around. And for one long moment I watched him deciding whether to run the con one more time, right there, in front of 80 witnesses. He chose Vanessa instead. That was, I think, the moment I understood the full shape of what he was. She knew what she was doing, he said, loud enough for the whole room, already pivoting, already building the next version of the story where he was somehow the deceived party instead of the architect. This was her idea, half of it. I never asked her to fake any records. That's on her. The sound Vanessa made then wasn't a word. It was something smaller and worse than a word, a kind of collapse, and I watched, in real time, in front of 80 guests, the exact moment a frightened woman understood that the man who'd promised to make her problems disappear was going to make her disappear instead, the first chance he got. That's not. She started, and stopped, and started again. Tears coming now, real ones, the kind that don't perform for a room. Richard, I never wanted to hurt you. My mother, the facility, I didn't know how else. I know about your mother, I said, and I meant it gently. Because whatever else was true, Raina's information about the memory care facility had never once left my chest since I'd heard it. Raina found that 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry for what you were carrying. I am. But you lied to me for 8 months, Vanessa. You let me believe I was going to hold a child in my hands that never existed. You let my daughter watch me believe that, and swallow her own grief about it, because she loved me too much to say what she suspected. That's not something a scared woman does by accident. That's something you built, carefully, room by room, the same way I build a watch. Marcus was moving toward the door again, and this time Sal didn't ask him to stop. He simply stepped in front of it, arms crossed, immovable, in the specific way of a man who has personally watched 100 people try to leave a courtroom before they were legally free to. You should know, Sal said, mild as ever, that Rockport PD is aware of this gathering and has been briefed by the county prosecutor's office as of Thursday afternoon, given the financial fraud elements involved. There's an officer in a car in the lot who'd very much like to have a conversation with you about a man named Harold Feinberg. I want to be honest that this next part was not planned with any precision, and I've thought since about whether I should have let it happen at all. But Vanessa's cousin from Bangor, a heavy-set, soft-spoken woman named Priscilla who'd said maybe 6 words to me in 3.5 years of family gatherings, stood up from her table near the front, walked straight past me, and put her arms around Vanessa, who was sobbing now, openly, in front of everyone. "I don't care what she did," Priscilla announced to the room, her voice shaking but carrying. "I've known this girl since she was 7 years old, and I watched what that man's letters did to her the last 4 months, because she showed me 2 of them, scared out of her mind, asking if I thought she should just leave. So before anybody in this hall decides who the villain is here, I'd ask you to remember there's 2 of them standing in this room. And only one of them was ever planning to leave the other holding everything when the money moved. Nobody had asked her to say that. Nobody had planned for it. And it landed in that room the way only unplanned things can, cutting straight through the careful, controlled version of the confrontation I'd spent 3 weeks preparing. I looked at Marcus Vance, still pinned near the door by Sal's crossed arms and the unhurried authority of a retired clerk, and something in me that had been braced for a fight against my own marriage finally, fully redirected itself toward the man who'd built the whole machine. "You picked me because I buried a wife I loved for 29 years and thought I'd found something like it again," I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, did not shake. "You picked her because she's scared for her mother and desperate enough to believe a stranger's promises. That's not a scheme, Mr. Vance. That's just cruelty with better paperwork." Marcus's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're an old man playing detective," he said low, meant only for me, though the room was quiet enough that I suspect half of it heard anyway. "Margaret's probably relieved she died before she had to watch you fall for something this obvious." The room didn't just go silent this time. It went cold, the particular physical cold of 80 people simultaneously recoiling from something they wished they hadn't heard. Somewhere near the cake table, a woman gasped audibly. Claire's hand found mine under the table, gripping hard. I sat with that sentence for exactly as long as I needed to, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that it didn't break me the way I think Marcus intended it to. It did something else instead. It burned away the last soft, uncertain edge of doubt I'd been carrying about whether any part of this confrontation had been too harsh, too public, too much. Because a man who reaches for a dead woman's memory as a weapon in a room full of her family and friends has told you, more clearly than any court document ever could, exactly what he is. "You don't get to say her name," I said quietly. "Not you." And that was when the officer Sal had mentioned stepped through the side door, unhurried, professional, and asked Marcus Vance if he'd mind stepping outside to answer a few questions. He went. Not gracefully, and not without one more attempt to talk his way past the officer. Something about a misunderstanding, a business dispute blown out of proportion. But the door closed behind them both, and the guild hall exhaled all at once. 80 people letting go of a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding together. Vanessa didn't run after him. I want to say that clearly, because I think it matters. She sat where she was, Priscilla's arms still around her, and cried in a way that had nothing performed left in it, the crying of someone who has just watched the last, worst version of a lie collapse in front of everyone she knows. I didn't go to her right away. I sat with my own hands, steady now in a way they hadn't been in weeks, and let Claire's grip on my arm anchor me while the room slowly, awkwardly began finding its footing again. It was Sam, my grandson, 9 years old, who broke the silence in the way only a child can, without any of the careful calculation the rest of us had been running for 3 weeks. "Grandpa," he said, tugging my sleeve, his voice carrying in that clear, unfiltered way children's voices do in rooms full of adults trying to be quiet. "Why did she pretend to have a baby? Isn't that a really mean thing to pretend?" A few nervous laughs rippled through the tables closest to us, the release of tension a room needs sometimes, and I looked down at my grandson's serious, 9-year-old face and understood I owed him an honest answer, not a simplified one. "Some grown-ups get so scared of losing something," I told him, "that they convince themselves lying is the only way to keep it. It's never true. But it's a hard thing to learn, even for grown-ups." Sam considered that, with the particular gravity children bring to questions they've decided actually matter. That seems like it would just make everything worse. It usually does, I said. I want to tell you the rest of that afternoon resolved itself neatly, but that isn't quite true, and I don't think it would be honest to pretend otherwise. Vanessa was escorted to speak with a second officer in a side room near the coat check, not arrested that day, though I'd learn in the weeks that followed that the county prosecutor was building a fraud case that would eventually charge both her and Marcus Vance, separately. With differing degrees of culpability, the courts would spend the following spring sorting out. Marcus, it turned out, had two more open investigations waiting for him once. Rockport PD ran his real name through the system, one in Nevada, one in Ohio, both involving widowers and remarriages and trust amendments that had moved a little too smoothly. Harold Feinberg's son, when Raina called to tell him, reportedly cried on the phone for the first time since his father's case had closed 4 years earlier, not from grief, but from the strange, hard relief of learning the man who'd hurt his family hadn't simply vanished into thin air to do it again unchecked forever. Vanessa pled guilty, eventually, to a lesser fraud charge, cooperating fully against Marcus in exchange for a sentence that involved restitution and probation rather than prison, a decision I did not fight, and, if I'm honest, quietly hoped for. I never got my 60% back, because there had never really been 60% to take, only a plan that hadn't closed in time. What I got instead, in the weeks after that guild hall emptied out and the cake nobody ate went into the trash, was something I hadn't expected to need nearly as badly as I did. Claire and Tom stayed at my house for 4 days after the shower, not because anything dangerous remained, but because none of us, I think, wanted to be alone with the size of what had almost happened. Sam slept in his old room, the one with the faded model ship wallpaper Margaret had picked out for him years before he was even born, back when we used it as a guest room, and every morning he'd wander into the kitchen while I made coffee and ask me some new, unguarded question about the whole affair, working through it the honest way children do, out loud, without shame. The guild itself surprised me most of all. In the 2 weeks after the shower, I received, without asking for a single 19 separate visits and calls from members I hadn't spoken to in months, old customers whose watches I'd repaired decades ago, 3 of the 12 scholarship students I'd quietly funded over the years, all of them having somehow heard, the way small towns hear everything eventually, and none of them arriving with pity, exactly. They arrived instead the way old friends show up after a storm, quietly, with casseroles and firewood and no expectation of being thanked. Standing in my driveway just long enough to say they were glad I was all right, and then leaving before I could feel obligated to perform gratitude I didn't yet have the strength for. Sal Marchetti came by 3 separate evenings that first week, always with a chess set he never once asked me to actually play, just set up on the porch table between us while we sat in silence and watched the harbor go dark the way Margaret and I used to. I understood something, sitting on that porch one of those evenings, that I don't think I could have understood any other way. For 7 years I had believed that strength meant carrying grief alone, quietly, without asking anyone to help me hold it. I had believed that showing Claire I was fine was a kindness to her, when really it had only ever been a wall, one that had left me lonely enough, frightened enough of every hospital corridor and every quiet Tuesday, that a stranger with a logo on his water bottle had correctly identified me, from a distance, as exactly the kind of man who could be gotten to. The letter from the pocket watch sat on the shelf above my workbench for 19 days after the shower. I looked at it most mornings and left it there. Most mornings, too, not from fear anymore, but because I understood. The way you understand a movement isn't quite ready to be closed back up, that I hadn't yet built the life around myself, that would let me receive whatever Margaret had written without it knocking me flat. I finally read it on a Sunday, at Claire's kitchen table, with Claire and Tom and Sam all there, because I had decided, somewhere in those 19 days, that I was done reading the important things alone. Margaret's handwriting had always slanted slightly to the left. Quick, impatient, the handwriting of a woman who thought faster than her pen could keep up with. The letter was 11 months old when she died, which meant she'd written it not long after her diagnosis, in that strange window when she still had enough strength to plan for a future she must have already suspected she wouldn't see. I'll share only the part that matters most because the rest of it belongs to me and to no one else. She'd written, Richard, if you're reading this, it means you finally open this old watch of my father's the way I always meant you to. Someday, when you were ready to hear from me again instead of just missing me. I need you to know something you've never once let yourself believe, even after 29 years of me telling you. You are not a man who's hard to love. You are a man who's careful about who gets to. Someday you'll let someone new pass that carefulness, and I hope you do. Because a man like you shouldn't spend the second half of his life alone just to prove he can. But Richard, please, don't ever mistake being careful for being weak. The same eyes that catch a hairline crack in a 100-year-old dial will catch a lie in a person's heart, too. If you let yourself trust what you're seeing instead of talking yourself out of it, because you're afraid of being alone again. Trust your own eyes. You've always had the best ones I ever knew. I read that last line out loud 3 times before my voice finally gave out entirely. And Claire, 29 years her mother's daughter in every way that mattered, came around the table and held me the way I should have let her hold me 7 years earlier, the way I should have let her hold me 100 small times since. Instead of quietly canceling appointments and avoiding hospital wings and telling myself steadiness was the only gift I had left to give my own family. Sam, watching all this with the wide, careful eyes of a 9-year-old trying to understand grown-up grief, finally asked the question that, I think, closed the whole story better than anything I could have said myself. Grandma knew you'd figure it out, he said. Not quite a question. Even before it happened. I think she did, I told him. I think she always knew exactly what I was capable of, even on the days I didn't. I gave Sam the pocket watch that same afternoon, crystal freshly replaced. Movement cleaned and oiled for the first time in years, and I taught him, the way I'd once taught his mother, how to wind it properly, slow, patient turns, never forcing the crown past where it wants to stop. You have to be gentle with old things, I told him, even when they've been sitting still a long time, especially then. It's been 4 months now since that afternoon at the Guildhall. Vanessa completed her plea agreement in February. I understand, through channels I don't chase too closely, that she moved back to be near her mother's facility, working, trying, as far as anyone can tell, to build something honest out of what's left. I don't wish her further harm. I think, in the end, she was as much a casualty of Marcus Vance's particular cruelty as I nearly was, even if the harm she did to me was real, and I won't pretend otherwise. Marcus is currently awaiting trial in 2 states, and Harold Feinberg's son has agreed, along with Claire and me, to testify about the pattern once the case reaches that stage, because I understood, once Raina laid it all out plainly, that a man like that doesn't stop on his own. Somebody has to be willing to stand in a room and say it out loud. I go to my cardiology appointments now. All of them. I haven't missed one since November. I even walked through the east wing of Rockport Memorial 2 weeks ago, for the first time in 7 years, to sit with an old guild member recovering from surgery, and I won't pretend it didn't cost me something to do it. But I did it, and I sat with him for an hour, and I drove home afterward, feeling lighter than I expected. The particular lightness of a weight finally set down instead of carried past the point it needed to be. Claire and I have dinner together every Sunday now, no occasion required, just the ordinary, deliberate kind of closeness I let 7 years of quiet grief convince me I didn't need to ask for. Sam winds his great-grandfather's watch every morning before school carefully, the way I taught him, and last week he told me very seriously, over pancakes, that he thinks old things are better than new things because old things had to survive something to still be here. I told him his grandmother used to say almost exactly that about a chipped teapot once, a long time ago, in a very different context, and he asked me to tell him the whole story, and I did, all of it, because I've decided that's the only way any of this makes sense in the end. Not hidden, not carried alone, told, plainly, to the people who love you, so the truth has somewhere to live besides the inside of one careful, tired old man. I spent most of my life believing that strength meant never letting anyone see the crack in the mechanism. 41 years at a workbench taught me differently. In the end, though it took losing almost everything to finally hear the lesson. Real strength isn't hiding the flaw. It's having the courage to open the case back in front of the people who love you and let them see exactly what needs fixing and trust that they'll help you fix it instead of walking away from what they find. If this story meant something to you tonight, if you've ever trusted the wrong person, or doubted your own eyes when they were trying to warn you, or carried grief alone because you thought that was the strong thing to do, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it. And I hope whatever careful, guarded part of you is still protecting an old wound, you'll remember what my wife of 29 years wanted me to know all along. Trust your own eyes. They've probably always known more than you were willing to admit.